We'll get started. Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting, let a few more people join, and we'll get started in just a moment. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Kelly, and along with Lauren Bernard, I'm co-president of the Brookline Parents Organization, and we'd like to welcome you tonight. We're very excited to have Brookline's new superintendent, Dr. Linus Guillory, here with us to have a Q&A. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions ahead of time. It gave us a good foundation to start planning the conversation with. But feel free to pop questions in the Q&A as we go through the evening, if they're directly related to what we're talking about or not. We can't promise we'll get to everything, but we'll do our best. And just a little about the Brookline Parents Organization. We're a townwide organization of parents. We have multiple goals, but one of our principal goals is facilitating communication and sharing information with everyone. And we've done a number of these conversations on a broad range of different topics over the last year and a half or so over Zoom. Our hope is that they can help everybody stay more informed, learn more, and also create a dialogue back and forth. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Lauren to introduce tonight's discussion.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us on this, unfortunately, soggy July evening. I'm very pleased that we're having this conversation tonight with Dr. Linus Guillory, our new superintendent in Brookline. And to moderate the event, we have Priya Tahiliani, who is a Brookline parent and who also herself is a superintendent of Everett Schools since March of 2020. So she has been extremely busy. A little bit about Priya is before coming to Everett, she spent 19 years in the Boston public school system as an administrator, 3 years as an assistant superintendent of the Office of English Language Learners, and prior to that as other administrative teaching responsibilities for a total of 19 years. We're very pleased that Priya has agreed to do this. And she did overlap apparently for about a year with Dr. Guillory in the Boston school system. So they actually know each other, which is a great, which makes the whole discussion easier for everybody, I think. And we encourage you, like I said, to put questions, or like Ben said, to put questions in the chat. We will do our best to get to all of them. But with that, I'll let Priya introduce Dr. Guillory, and stay tuned for a great Q&A discussion. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ben and Lauren. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the BPO for inviting me, and to everyone in the Brookline community that is joining us this evening. I feel really honored to be able to facilitate this community conversation with our new superintendent, Dr. Linus Guillory. As Lauren mentioned, I have been a Brookline resident and parent for over 13 years. My husband and I, who are both educators, moved to Brookline specifically for the schools. And so this community and the education that it provides are very near and dear to me and my family. So again, I wanted to thank everybody who already submitted questions, and invite anyone who has not to please submit their questions in the chat, as Lauren and Ben mentioned, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Thus far, the topics are running the gamut between social emotional learning to budget prioritization to potentially revamping the middle school experience. So it looks like we're going to have a robust discussion. But before we jump straight into our discussion, I did want to both introduce Dr. Guillory and give him an opportunity to provide us with some welcoming remarks. He is our new superintendent. We're very excited to have him. Prior to joining Brookline, Dr. Guillory served as the Chief Schools Officer in the Lowell Public Schools, so that's where he's joining us from. He also worked as the Deputy Superintendent of Teaching and Learning, Chief of Schools, and Director of Science at the Rochester City School District in Rochester, New York. And he worked at the NASA Space Center in Houston for 6 years as an education specialist, helping educators access NASA education products, and is the program director for the Johnson Space Center Pre-Service Teacher Fellowship Institute. He earned his BA in biology with a minor in chemistry at Texas A&M, and he went on to earn his PhD in environmental science at Oklahoma State University. So with that, Dr. Guillory, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Priya, for a warm welcome and introduction. And thank you to Lauren and Ben for this invite. I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to spend time with you all this evening, or whenever you choose to view this recording. As Priya said, I'm Linus Guillory, and I am elated to join the Brookline community as the superintendent of schools. I've been a tad busy since joining July 1st. Certainly day one, walking in, signing some personnel contracts and those types of things for individuals joining the team. And then certainly spending time and space and energy visiting schools. So I've had the opportunity to get out and see at this point, I think 3 of our school buildings and facilities, as well as meeting as many of the faculty and staff that work in Brookline, as well as many of the students, spending some time with students in some of the summer meetings that I've had. So I, again, appreciate this opportunity and look forward to being a member immersed in the community.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Dr. Guillory, and let's jump right into the questions. So one of the topics that I know is at the forefront of all of our minds is social emotional learning and wellness. This is always a topic of importance, but even more so after the year from which we've just emerged. So what are your plans on how to provide social and emotional learning and support to students and perhaps even staff and faculty this upcoming school year?
I think one of the key steps that we will be taking, or one of the steps that I think I've already taken, is to make sure that we have a senior leadership team in place. So as many of you know in the community, or if you don't know, you will know now, is that we've had quite a bit of transition here at central office. And that has afforded an opportunity to bring in some new talent to the district. So in that, we've hired a new deputy superintendent for administration and finance, and that's Mr. Sam Rippon, and he's joining us out of that role out of Dedham Public Schools. We have Ms. Leslie Ryan Miller, who you all may know already as a former Pierce principal. She's joining us as the Deputy of Teaching and Learning. You all know Casey No Miller. She is continuing on the team as the Deputy Superintendent for Student Support Services. We've added Ms. Janae Utaro out of the high school as the Senior Director of Equity. You all may know Erin Cooley. She's been a member of the team as the Senior Director of Data and Strategy. And our last senior level member is Ty Fluker, who's joining us out of Boston Public Schools to be our Director of Human Resources. So in that, we have a full suite of senior leadership members. The specifics around social emotional learning within access for our students, there have been a number of positions that are being filled and have been added in the system. While I don't have the specifics of those spots and those names, I think we as a senior team have already begun discussions about how we want to make sure we ease back or transition back into school. And with that, we've talked about those students or families that haven't had the opportunity to experience the traditional brick and mortar of the building, that there will need to be some transition planning that happens with those students and families. Certainly those students that participated in the RLA, they need an opportunity to transition and come back into the traditional building as well. So as the senior team meets next week, we're actually engaging in our summer leadership retreat for the administrators. That's happening Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. And these are the types of topics that our building leaders will be directly engaged in to see how might we service and support our students, families, and staff at a deeper, more personal level at that moment.
Thank you so much. And a question just came in, and this is similar to another one that we had received earlier, which is that after this pandemic year, teachers have kind of been run through the gambit. I know that all staff have, switching strategies constantly, being asked to go above and beyond for, 180 days straight, and yet never being able to meet the expectations of all the stakeholders. And I can definitely sympathize with that feeling of not being able to meet all of the different expectations. So the faculty and staff well-being, what is your plan for rebuilding morale and supporting them this upcoming school year?
So my mantra, or I won't say mantra at this point, my task right now is to engage in deep listening and learning with the community. So what I'm actually beginning to work through, and I think I'll be starting that the last week of July, is to begin my entry plan into the community. And that's a deep listening and learning tour, for lack of better terminology, where I will engage in one-on-one sessions with several members, but then also the group sessions with a variety of stakeholders. But my goal is to try to touch as many of the stakeholders as possible while engaging in this listening and learning tour. I think a big part of rebuilding or establishing, in my case, trust and rapport is to actually get out and meet and interact with folks, hear what their needs are, understand what those are, process those needs, and then say how and when do we fit those specific needs in. I think as a superintendent, one of the big roles that I have is being the chief learner for the district, but also being the chief leader. And in that regard, I have to be out engaging and interacting with the stakeholders. So that means being in lots of classrooms. That means being receptive and responsive to hearing. We're not always going to get exactly what we want in that regard, but we can have a conversation about what it is and what our mutual interests are, and agree to work on those wholeheartedly. So I think my big task in terms of rebuilding morale will be to first understand what's been happening here, and then add to complement that or extend that beyond and say, what can we do to enhance and build back? And that's what I'm most excited about. I think at this point, it's July 18th, and I think it's, if I'm not counting incorrectly, I think it's 11 days on the job. So the first 2 days were July 1 and 2, and that was meeting all the folks here on the 5th floor, getting out and visiting a few folks that were working over the summer, signing contracts and documents as such. And then July 6th was a school committee workshop, and that spent quite a bit of time with the school committee. And then the following week, I've been out at professional development myself, attending the statewide superintendent's conference. So in that, I had an opportunity to meet with many superintendents across the state, including Priya, where we talked about, had conversations about those things that we have in common and how might we as a state respond and engage in some best practices, but then also those of us with similarities in demographics and school types and school size. We spent time and space together. And then also as a new superintendent, I also spent a day working with the 36 other new superintendents across the state in terms of what challenges and opportunities sit and exist within their respective districts. So a long answer to say a lot of face-to-face time with faculty and staff, hearing what their needs are, and then saying how can we collectively work together to rebuild and establish the Brookline that we know we're capable of being, but the Brookline that we want to be. And in order for us to do that, it's not Linus dictating that this is the way it's going to be, but it's certainly how can we work together to build and establish that district that we're looking for and that we know is here.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. Another topic of a lot of discussion right now, and I know it was brought up quite a bit at the superintendent's conference we were at, is how to address learning loss for our students. But the reality is that while some students have fallen behind, others have kept up or even used their free time during the pandemic to accelerate their learning. So the question is, how do you think our schools should be assessing student proficiency and even tailoring instruction so that each student gets what they need to thrive?
Again, this is another topic that I'm planning to engage our leaders in next week. Certainly, they've been here in the trenches, working on the front lines with the teachers and certainly with the parents. So understanding those unique needs. I know that there's been quite a bit of shifting, also in terms of some of the programming that Brookline has offered, and now looking to redefine some of those or study those for this year. All of that's sort of on my radar. I don't have the specific nuanced answers of what was done here, but I think the broader scope is while we say learning loss, our students actually learned a tremendous amount. And I think that's what Priya was saying as she introduced the question. But I think it's also then how do we accelerate or how do we dovetail what experiences our students had to make sure that the curricular experience that they're expected to get this year, that elements where the students may feel that they are not as equipped or where parents feel that their students are not as equipped, that we build in time and space or we allow flexibility and opportunity for that. And that's a lot of customization when you're thinking about nearly 7,000 students, is how to make that happen. And so each building community will undertake that. But the charge will be how do we get students what they actually need? And I think that's not a cookie cutter response. It's not a cookie cutter program, and it's certainly not a one size fits all. And so I think each community will engage in thoughtful discourse and planning around how to best meet the various students' need in that regard.
Thank you. So on this same topic of instruction and curriculum, there has been much discussion in Brookline about minutes spent on social studies and science instruction. In fact, there was a report in 2020 from one of our Brookline parents, Meghna Chakraborty, that contended that K-5 science and social studies classroom time had been cut between 55 to 65% since 2011, with the majority of those cuts happening in the 1920 school year. So Dr. Guillory, you know, as a former science teacher yourself and as someone who spent years running an education program at NASA, what are your thoughts not only on the importance of these specific subject areas, but on how you may go about assessing and even potentially modifying Brookline's approach to learning?
Yeah, so you know, that wounds my heart for a lack of better terminology. But at the same time, the leaders that made that decision for what they felt were valid reasons. Whether we all agreed with it or whether we all disagreed with it, the leadership at the time made that determination. I think at this point, with a well-rounded leadership team now in place, I think that's an opportunity for us to go back and revisit to say what makes the most sense. We certainly have to have that conversation also with our best thought partners, being the parents as well as the teachers in this regard. So what might we do collectively to ensure that Brookline students are the best prepared when they matriculate from Brookline High School? So in that, it's going to be some deep conversation. There have to be certainly negotiations when you start talking about time, because we have a finite amount of time in the school day. And each minute is sacred. Certainly as a former science teacher, as Priya talked about, I was very protected, and I had the good fortune to teach on a modified block. So I had a nice chunk of time when I was teaching science, 8th grade science to be exact, and I cherished and I protected every minute of time. Because I knew how important my content was, not that it was superior to the math teacher or the social studies teacher or the ELA teacher, but I knew that it was sacred. It was sacred time and dedicated for making sure that students were best prepared when they left my classroom. So I think similarly, we need to engage in that productive dialogue to make sure that our students are best prepared. And one of the things that, again, I keep talking about next week, but one of the things that I've asked head of school Meyer to talk about is to look at the bridge or the handoff between 8th grade and 9th grade. And while we're also looking at doing some studying this year of the middle school model, what also makes sense when our K-8 students or our 8th graders move up to 9th grade, and how can we ensure that they're best positioned to take full advantage of all that Brookline High has to offer. And so those are the types of things that we're undertaking. Now, I preface all of this by saying the entry planning process that I'll be taking will also sort of lay out the time and space. There are going to be things that we must do in year one. We won't get to everything because the questions that have been asked thus far, if we did deep dives on all of that, you're already talking about 3, 4, 5 years worth of work already. And we're part way through the conversation. So it's how do we then pull on these threads either in concert or in tandem so that we can better serve or best serve our students through our staff. And so with all of these types of shifts or adjustments that happen in the system, they can't happen in isolation. So if we're talking about a shift of instruction for our students, a shift in their experience, then we also have to back map what does that mean for our teachers and staff? How do we back map professional development or their learning that has to occur so that they're better prepared? And then for them to have input and saying, this is what will be most helpful for us as we tackle or undertake this opportunity. So all of those types of things are not simple. And I know the question wasn't meant to be simple, to state that the issue was simple, but that's the complexities that are added in each of these cases.
So you talked a little bit about looking at that transition from 8th to 9th grade. And I think I mentioned earlier, we'd received some questions about the middle school model and you being open to re-examining the middle school experience, both academically and from the extracurricular standpoint. Have you, I know again, you're at the initial stages of your listening and your learning tour, but have you started to hear a little bit about, our model, and do you have any initial thoughts?
I don't. I know that, I do have thoughts on it. But again, it's not Linus coming in and saying, this is the way it's going to go. What I want to do is hear from all parties involved. I know that there has been some dialogue. I certainly listened to many of the committee meetings where both parents and staff called in with concerns with some adjustments to a particular campus's instructional model. But again, I think what we have to do, again, we're not going to always agree on every aspect of it, but at the end of the line, the question that we're all asking or seeking to ask is what's in the absolute best interest of our children. And what we also need to be mindful of is that models or shift or ebb and flow depending on the students that are in front of us. So the experiences that we had in school are very much different from the experiences that our kids are going through now. And that's because the students, the manner in which they're coming prepared has shifted or adjusted over time. So our models have to be flexible and adaptable to ensure that they're meeting the needs of the students they're serving.
Well, so another question just came in. Will you be looking at reading and writing as they are taught or should be taught, especially to our kids who need direct, explicit instruction with either word recognition or language comprehension issues? Is that a priority?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that um, every aspect of Brookline, I want to get as familiar with as the constituents that are currently served by the system. My limiting reagent is time. So I won't have the time dedicated that you all have experienced these to really study it or experience it as deeply. But what I do want to do is make sure that I have enough of an understanding and rely on the experts in the field to give us some guidance and direction on that. And I think that's one of the great aspects about pulling or bringing to the senior leadership team some of the experience or veteran experience within the system, so that our startup time is not as long or would be as long as if the whole new team, the team came in from outside of the district. So I think we have a nice mix of internal senior members as well as external senior members to bring a balanced approach to the system. But certainly looking at, what are our current strengths? So I want to look at this from an asset-based point of view versus a deficit mindset in that regard, because there are many strengths here. And so the goal is, how do we grow, expand, and build upon those strengths that we presently have? And it won't necessarily be a tear down in those cases, but how do we extend what we presently have to ensure that all students are benefiting or experiencing that? And so those students that, the classic bell curve model, those students that are getting exactly what they need. We have those students that are high achievers. So how do we extend and expand for them? And then those students that may need more time on task or may need additional supports to support their learning. How do we make sure that they get what they need as well? And that's the beauty of making sure that we're tailoring resources to meet their needs.
Wonderful. So on the other side of the listening and learning, which I know is going to be a huge part of what you're doing moving forward, I know I just completed my own listening and learning tour and my own entry findings after the first year. The other side of that is the communication that then goes out from you and that filters throughout the district. So what are your approaches for both communicating with staff and communicating with parents and families? And what strategies will you employ or utilize moving forward?
So I've actually had a taste of some of that already. Even as I was announced, I received several emails when I was working in Lowell, and I attempted to respond to those right away. I think what I want to do again is extend some of the best practices or better practices that have already been established here. And we've started having conversations around those. So as we get closer to the start of school, I know Dr. Marini launched sort of a weekly message out to the community. I want to engage in that. I want to take advantage of opportunities like the one tonight to engage with families. I've been working actually since my interview with a group of high school students and staff that it's sort of expanded. And we've been having, at the time, it seemed we were having frequent Zoom meetings in terms of some work that those students were spearheading at the high school. And those meetings are now less frequent. But we're still at least touching a base once a month in that regard. So looking at, so it will be, I think, the communications that come out from central office, but it will also be engaging with the parent groups, the meetings, the established meetings, those types of things. But my task now is to understand how broad those various meetings are, how frequent they occur, and make sure that I attend to or have representation at most, if not all of those. One of the things that we want to do is things that are topics that are frequent or hot in that regard is making sure that we are advancing front loading that information to try to be as transparent. My goal is to be as transparent as possible. There aren't any secrets in this regard, and we want to make sure that we hear what's working well. I often take cases, and Priya, we've been at this now for more than 20 years in various capacities in the system, is we often hear what's wrong with the system more so than we hear what's working well. So I throw that question back or share that question back to the community to say, how might we understand what's working well for you, or get some feedback on those types of things so that we can replicate or grow those versus being in the response mode more often than not than to challenges or issues. So I think that's an opportunity to open as well and think about it from that perspective, is what's working well for you. What would you like more of in that regard, so that we can make sure that we're spending time and attention in those areas. But certainly Zoom opportunities, the pandemic, for better or worse, has opened this threshold of Zoom to us that makes communication in these forums a little bit more accessible. Folks can sit in the comfort of their home or their boat or driving down the road and engage in conversation in this regard, versus putting our lives on hold to come to a centralized location for a meeting. So I'm certainly open to learning. Certainly these types of webinars I think are helpful for the communication aspects, but there are already a number of established meetings with the central office, as well as with various parent groups. Same thing for teachers and staff. With the president of the teachers union, I know that there have been some established meetings. And so all of those types of things I want to hold and honor. First, I want to understand what the establishment is, and then honor those traditions that have already been established.
And so we so appreciate, you joining us here tonight. And I do think that this starts us on a great path forward as far as communication. I think one thing that always works well is communication. I know the more I hear from my child's school and teachers, the better. Do you have, this is another question that just came in, do you have any expectations you talked about the communication that you plan to have and leadership would have with families, and then that leadership would have with staff? Do you have any expectations for the communication or outreach that teachers should be having with families, and what those point of contacts should be beyond open house or parent-teacher conference days?
Oh, absolutely. But before I let that cat out of the bag, I first want to understand what's here. And what are those expectations? I can tell you some of the things that when I was teaching, what the expectation was around that. So I grew up with that level of understanding. I took it upon myself as a best practice that I heard from experienced educators, was that prior to the first day of school, I personally called or contacted each of my middle school students at that time, each of their households as such. We've certainly seen a number of innovative opportunities through the pandemic where schools engaged in our experience in Lowell was that many of the schools said that they've never had so much parent contact and involvement as a result that was a byproduct or a good byproduct of the pandemic experience. So I think that we've learned quite a bit through the pandemic that are better practices or best practices that have evolved us. And so the question becomes, how do we maintain that level of involvement and commitment? And certainly taking that, again, that partnership of what works best for a particular, for a body of students for this time and space, I think is the way we need to adapt for it. But certainly I have some ideas around that. But I first want to understand what's the standard. And the question becomes, is that the gold standard? is that the standard that we want to hang our hats on and say, this is what the best that Brookline has to offer? And so those are going to be sort of my reflective or probing questions when I'm hearing or learning about things.
And what do you think an appropriate response time would be for administrators at schools or at the district office who receive emails or phone messages from children's families? And will that timing be made clear to families so that they'll know what to expect, especially if there is a problem for their child?
Absolutely. So we will all agree on what that response will be. Certainly, I grew up in Rochester. We had a standard of within 48 hours. But again, I want to understand what's the Brookline experience here is, and we will make a determination and communicate that out as well. I think what I've seen or what I've been experiencing thus far is that how do we capitalize on the support? So Priya, I think in your opening remarks, you talked about the importance of the reputation of the public schools here. And so how then do we maintain, accelerate, and grow that reputation and make sure that the experience also meets and matches that as well?
Thank you. And sorry, I'm just going through the questions. So to switch gears just a little bit about inclusive practices, how will you assist the district and the individual schools in becoming more aware and inclusive to our children who are autistic, visually impaired, mentally ill, hearing impaired, neurologically impaired, et cetera?
I think that's a great opportunity. I've certainly been looking at the budget, and that's it's funny. The questions are fascinating, by the way, and spot on, and are actually also in a way sort of giving me some buckets or developing some themes for the entry plan as well, because I think about, since I've been in the community, and I use the air quotes there because we were all in Zoom land when we started. I started the interviewing process, but again, these recursive themes or topics that come up, and special education is one that certainly has my attention and interest, because again, I want to understand certainly the makeup of our students and the families and the needs there, but then also understand how our schools can better serve and grow our own practices. And so I think that the expectation will certainly be communicated, but it has to go beyond expectation. And that means that we have to put support and resources behind it as well, which also means professional development and training for our faculty and staff. And so, all of these are hot items. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all. I think these are pressing items that are important for our students. Our kids only have one time to be first graders. They only have one time to be second graders. And so we want to make that the most vivid experience and best experience for them. So we as practitioners have to make sure that we are doubling down on our growth and development so we can constantly adapt to the needs of our constituents best.
Wonderful. And as we talk about equity and inclusion for our diverse student populations, and we think about how we're going to examine our curriculum through that lens and to ensure that there is diverse representation, what are your thoughts on what that would look like in the Brookline Public Schools, and how you would then communicate that to our parents about what is being taught about the history of treatment of diverse populations, for example?
So that's one of the big rocks and a big opportunity for our school system, for our state, and for our country. And in that, when Ms. Utaro accepted the offer to join the team as the Senior Director of Equity and Inclusion, one of the first conversations that we had following that was that anything that we're asking our building leaders to do, anything that we're asking our teachers to undertake, anything that we're asking our staff to undertake, we as a senior team must first get experience or training on it or in it in that regard. And so what I've asked her to start thinking about and sketching out is sort of what's the training or professional experience for our senior leadership team, which would then impact our principals, assistant principals, coordinators, and such, so that we have a coordinated approach to doing that. And then Janae would then work in concert, certainly with the other senior team members, because it's not just the curricular aspect of it, but it's all aspects of our system. So how do we truly institute a systems approach to what's happening here in Brookline, so that it's not regarded as some fad or experienced as a passing fad, but something that really gets interwoven into our DNA. And that doesn't mean that we're singling a particular instance out. It means that this is who we are. This is who the community has stated that it is. And that's the expectation that the community has of the public schools, is to ensure that students experience that. And so it's not just going to be a pull the shade on the curriculum. It's actually going to be, how do we operate and how do we do business? How do we look at all aspects of our system to ensure that our students are best prepared to go into the world in which they will thrive? And so it's not just the curricular front. The curricular front is important, and that will be led by Mrs. Ryan Miller. But it will also be in conjunction with the expectations that I've communicated to our Senior Director of Equity, but that our senior leadership team is well versed in. And so it comes, in that instance, it comes from the top. So that is one that I'll take a more directive stance on, is to say, based on the feedback from the committee, this is the direction that we want to take. I want to make sure that through the entry plan, what themes again are emerged. I'm not going to force those. Those will naturally present themselves, and then we'll take a discourse and we'll take discourse up to then start discussing what a strategic plan is. And so it's looking at those goals to make sure that everything is connected, so that we don't inadvertently silo our district by having sort of these single stacks of this is the body of work, but that we actually have a fabric, so that it communicates a beautiful pattern of what our community is and what we expect our students to experience. And again, while our faculty and staff work here, this is a place that I want them to, again, feel the growth and the thriving in their professional world as well, because you should be happy coming to work. It shouldn't be, this is a place you should look forward to coming to. And that's the experience that I'd like for folks to have that are working in the system, that you're proud to be here, that you're excited to be here, and that that you have a voice and your voice matters, but you can also put your shoulder to the wheel to help move the work.
So speaking of the staff, what do you see as your role and relationship with the Brookline Educators Union, and how do you view the union's role in educating our students?
Well, certainly our teachers are on the front line. Having been a classroom teacher, I can certainly say that I understand that body of work. And so with that, it's in partnership. And again, what I want to be able to do is look at our systems from a value standpoint and say, how are we doing against our values? What are our core commitments? And how are we measuring up against that? So certainly, we can't move the system. We can't move our students without our teachers. And again, I think during my interview, I talked about faculty, students, and staff are my number one priority. Students are priority 1A, and faculty and staff are priority 1B. both of them are priority, and they go, I can't talk about having the highest performing students in the state without talking about having the highest performing faculty and staff in the state. So you can't have one without the other in that regard. So they are linked, and we are all linked together. And so this is part of the work that we must understand. So as I shared earlier, that's going to be my work with the union president, is to understand again what's been happening here, what's been working well, and those things that haven't been working as well. How can we get to a point where we are moving forward with our students always on the forefront? They're the leading edge, and we, as the faculty and staff, are pushing or moving them along.
Right. And what are your plans to keep and attract good teachers, just in general, and our special education teachers, but also to recruit, mentor, and retain educators of color?
Yeah, so I think one of that is certainly understanding, certainly broadcasting or promoting what it is that Brookline has to offer. In terms of, class sizes, those types of things. And certainly we're not going to use the pandemic year as the model year, in that there's certainly a number of benefits. I mean, Brookline, what I've seen thus far, really resources it's public schools. You have some of the newest schools in the state. All of those aspects are very attractive to teachers, but then it's also then the technical or the nuance pieces of how do you get folks here, but then also how do you keep them here? And I think those are parts where I have each of my senior team members coming up with their goals and objectives. And one of those is certainly retention. So it's one thing to get folks here, but it's another thing to keep them. And we have to understand, again, what do we have that others don't have to offer, or what do we have to offer that others have, but why is ours better? We can all go car shopping, and I'm not reducing the teaching profession at all to cars, but we can all go car shopping and looking for a car, but what makes you buy car A over car B? It has a little something more to offer now. So I think it's having our teachers share what that actually is. I don't need to dictate what that is from central office. Teachers can tell us better than anyone what it actually takes to get more folks here. How do we keep them here? And so it's, again, setting up those opportunities or experiencing those opportunities. I'm a superintendent. My job as school chief was to certainly be out in schools. So that's something that's interwoven in my DNA. So you will see me in your classrooms, whether I'm in there for 2 minutes or whether I sit in there or in 15 to 20 minutes, but you will see me in your classrooms. And I'm not in there, I'm in there to see what the best of what makes our system unique, and talk about that, brag about that in the system and at our superintendent's meetings and in other places where I have opportunities, but then also to say, what else can we do to support our faculty and staff? But there are a number of strategies for certainly attracting folks, and it's certainly working with the BEU in that regard, but it's also working with our committee as well, because I think there are a number of greats that Brookline has to offer, but how do we advertise and promote those? And so I know Ty has quite a bit. Ty is our senior director of human resources, for those that may have joined late, has quite a bit of expertise in promoting that and doing some work in those areas.
And how are contract negotiations going with teachers? Where do you believe that we are in that process?
So where I know that we are is that we settled the contract with the para educators, but the opportunity still exists for the district and the BEU to come together to have some healthy conversation and actually settle or negotiate a contract and settle it. So right now, I think the district and the BEU are regrouping to say, how can we come back together to settle this contract, agree on a contract and settle it, so that we can get back to the business of teaching and learning without having that out hanging over our heads.
Great. So a question about COVID and safety precautions. Given that children under 12 are not eligible for COVID vaccination and that there is no longer a remote learning option, what COVID precautions will be in place this fall to keep all children, particularly those with pre-existing conditions, safe?
Yeah, so panel 4, whether folks realize it or not, met maybe 2 weeks ago now, I think, to begin having those conversations, or to continue those conversations about what would make most sense. We certainly will have the guidance of the Commissioner of Education. There was some talk about that last week at the Superintendent's Conference. So he will be putting out some guidance to us, hopefully sooner rather than later. But then also our Brookline Department of Public Health will also, I'm sure, weigh in or have some commentary as to what the direction should be as well. And so in partnership, so as soon as we have those decisions or determinations made, then you'll see a communication come out from the district as soon as practicable to make sure that families are aware of that. And we are, with the great opportunity that we have with our K-8s, building structure, as well as our 9-12, is that's, you know, that it's a finite breaking point in terms of elementary and then secondary in that regard. So I think we'll see some communications coming out sooner rather than later. And certainly parents, you know, I have an 8-year-old who still is very conscious of the pandemic. And you will see him wearing his mask whenever he's out in public. He's getting a little bit more lax now with it, but he, whenever we're in a building, a closed space, he will have his mask on. And that's a decision that that he makes conscientiously. Even when we say it's okay to take your mask off now, he still keeps it up. And it's not it's a sort of a natural thing with him. He's adapted, is doing quite well, but we support him in that as parents.
So what are some issues that you encountered in Lowell that you expect you will need to address in Brookline? And the inverse of that, are there any issues that you think you may encounter here in Brookline that you did not have to address in Lowell, and how might you address them?
Oh, that's as wide as the sea is deep. So I think that one aspect that I certainly saw was around the teaching of reading. So one of the struggle points, and I think this goes to what the learning loss question was getting at, was certainly our early learners that were developing their early literacy skills in a remote world. How might we now ensure that they have the foundational skills that they need now that we're returning back to in-person learning? So that gap of teaching reading in the virtual world or in the remote world was one that I think was universal across the system. And I haven't heard many people saying that they had something that really worked well in that regard. So that's one that I think is a similarity. In terms of differences, I know that there are some, and they will certainly present themselves, but one of the things that I say is that parents advocate for their children how they feel is best. My job as a superintendent is to be the parent of all 7,000 of the kids plus one, that one being my own. And that, so I'm advocating as strongly as you are for them as well. And so with that, we are on the same team, pulling together. And so I think that's a message that I would put out there. So I'm not directly addressing that particular question. And it's not that I'm avoiding it. It's just that I think the advocacy aspect of it. So in Texas, we had in parentis loca. So in absence of the parent, the teacher, that's how I grew up. So when the parent's not there, I'm the parent. And so that's an aspect that, again, that I hold near and dear to my heart, and knowing that you can trust and believe that I'm advocating for your kids as hard as you are as well. And so that's, won't say that that's the same or the difference, but that's just who I am as an educator.
So what keeps you up at night?
I'm beginning to think snow days is going to keep me up at night. After as much talk there was last week about snow days and calling snow days, I'm thinking that's one. I think making sure that I've made the best decisions, or making the best decisions for our students, staff, and families. I think that's one that I'm always thinking, what else could I have done to improve the life or the experience of a child? How else could we make our system better for our faculty and staff that work here? What else can we do to make sure that our parents' needs are being met? So I think those are the types of things that would lend themselves to keeping me up at night.
And what should parents know, and how can parents help?
So right now, what parents should know is that I'm on the job, I'm working. Allow me some patience and some grace as I undertake the many aspects and understanding deeply, because my goal is not to understand at a superficial level. I think to truly improve or have impact on the system is going to require some time. And so while it may seem that we're going slower, that I'm moving slow, I won't generalize this to the system, is that I need you to understand that I'm doing it to make sure that I'm understanding as much as I can about the system, so that in future years, I will have built a solid foundation of understanding of how the system operates, so that in future years or subsequent years that we can pick up the pace and move at a healthy clip. So I implore your patience as I undertake and begin this journey. Priya is ahead of me in the curve, so she'll be giving me some advice on what her experience was like. But certainly, I think the manner in which parents can be helpful is continue to stress, but I don't mean stress, the importance of good education, attending to school, being cognizant of your community and who's in your community. So how might we all work on becoming better citizens and participants in our community? So I think those are some of the initial things that I'm thinking about. But also schools will be reaching out, or our school principals will be reaching out to their individual communities to share their goals, their objectives for the year, and think about how you can engage and participate in that. And I look forward to meeting each and every one of you. I've certainly, those with whom I've already encountered, I'm making notes of which schools they're in, so that I can make sure that when I'm in those schools and those grades, I can go by and say hi to those students. But again, I want to be able to meet each and every parent in our system, as well as share time and space with each and every one of our kids. And by default, that means that certainly all of our faculty and staff.
So on to some operational questions, even though we know that operations in the world of education always extend further into the adaptive work that we do. As far as budget management and prioritization, what are your plans to change the budget to be driven by student, staff, and school needs rather than the other way around, meaning that the budget dictates what we can and do need?
So our opportunity there sits within our school improvement process and our site councils. So as I told you, there will be opportunities where these responses fit more naturally. So I think an opportunity when the question earlier, Priya, was what can we do to get engaged? And I think one of those pieces is engage in your schools, either your parent organization or your site council in that regard. So this question that's asked is very much one, we identify our education plan. This is what we want to do. And then we identify or build a budget that supports that. We have a finite amount of money, but we want to build our education plan first and then build our budget. And so through that, through our site councils, where our school improvement plans are built or developed, that's where then schools communicate what it is or what goals they're actually going to tackle. So I think those become some of the nuanced pieces to start driving that. I think financial stability and transparency is one aspect that I really want to tackle here, so that our community has confidence that our school department is expending those funds and using those funds in a responsible manner. And so part of that is many of the technical aspects of building our baseline. What are our FTE, our how many staff members we have in those buildings, but more so in a broader sense, what are the goals that we actually want to tackle that then tie to the school improvement plan, which ties to the superintendent's goals, which then ties to the district goals and the strategic plan. So all of those we want to build a process flow through so that becomes more natural. And again, not siloed where you have these 10 different stovepipes, but we actually have a fabric woven across. So those are some of the types of things that I'm thinking about. But again, I want to understand what those current processes are, and then work to improve them or make them more lucid for all involved.
So as you may or may not be aware, we are hearing that enrollment has declined and that we are seeing particularly low numbers in our incoming kindergarten, which is a significant deviation from the past. Have you heard about the declining enrollment, and do you have any initial plans for addressing it?
Yeah, so I'm actually, I think the meeting is maybe tomorrow. No, next week to actually discuss enrollment. So I am aware, but what our present understanding is that many of our, we expect some grow back this summer. As we get closer to August, we're anticipating that we may gain 100 or so students back at that level, which will then allow us to open more sections at various schools. But I think the challenge is understanding our population and what may be limiting that. So Brookline, at the time I was, when the advertisement for the superintendent flyer was put, the enrollment was reported at 7,777 students. And I think right now we're roughly around maybe 6,700 or so. So that's roughly 1,000 students right now. And what we know through our enrollment offices that right now our international students are having difficulty. Their families are having difficulties obtaining visas and those types of things in order to get back to the United States. So there's been some contact there, but those families that are able to return are returning. So we anticipate some growth there. So what I want to understand is from the Chapter 70 funds, are districts going to be held to the higher standard with that deviation, or will we have some flexibilities around there? So I think the governor's budget may make some allowances for that, but I'm waiting to learn more about those pieces. But certainly as our enrollment ticks back up, we're going to be mindful about building and opening those sections and communicating that to families as soon as possible, because we all know I was a former elementary principal, and I know how important it is for the reasons that I think one of the question askers asked about how frequently do you expect teachers to communicate with parents. That's something that elementary teachers have a good practice of doing, is as soon as they know who the kids are that are in their classroom, that outreach to the parent to begin learning and building relationships with the families right away. So we know how important that is.
So on that same topic of enrollment, there's a related question, because there are families who left the district last year, because they wanted to send their children to private schools so that their children could go in person. And I think you mentioned, we're hoping a lot of those students do return, but in the case that they don't, and I have started to hear that several are potentially not returning. I know I myself actually did send my kids to private school last year, and will be returning them to the Runkle this fall, but I'm hearing from other families who are making this decision right now. And I think that a lot of it could be lent back to the fact that, there's been some concern over the years about the balanced literacy approach, about social studies and science instructional time. So what do you think we'll need to do in order to make sure we're getting those families back, or we're figuring out why it is that they may not be returning if they don't?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So how might we go about capturing that information? What might be the challenges that are actually those families that have exited the system? What are some of those challenges? I had an email conversation actually with a grandmother that had some concern about the services for her grandchild. And so for that reason, she moved the kid. They elected to move the student out to receive some services. And so my probing question was, well, tell me what actually happened there, or what's going on, or what service is the private or charter providing that we weren't, so that I can understand and unpack that. So my message to this forum, or to this group that's getting that information, is to certainly share that with me, so that I have an understanding. I can't solve a problem that I'm not aware of which I'm not aware. So in order to actually solve and address that, I think having some awareness of what the challenges are, so that we can certainly make sure that as we're moving forward, that we create a space to discuss and have dialogue about that, and then to make sure that we are communicating what adjustments or adaptations are being made, so that folks will feel comfortable returning their students back to the public schools of Brookline, because every student in our community, I would be honored to have all of them in the system, but we want to make sure that the needs are also being met and attended to.
Absolutely. So we've actually gotten through quite a few of the questions. I have a couple here that that I think you kind of touched on before, but I'll ask them. When you were talking about equity inclusion, are you speaking of particular groups, people of color, religions, or are you also including children with disabilities? And I think you touched on that a little before, but another question that I would kind of add on to that is, what are some good equitable and inclusive practices you've seen, especially for students who are on IEPs, that you may have utilized in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, there are certain, so I'm talking about all students, and there are different, people want to break all down into these different, I'm talking about all. every student that's enrolled in our district is included in the all. So part of that, though, is understanding what the diverse needs are and how then do we make sure that we're incorporated. So when I began teaching many moons ago, I had the opportunity to partner with a self-contained teacher. And what she would often do is in my science class, we would integrate her students in the self-contained classroom into the science classroom. So those grade level peers, even though their IEPs had them in a sub-separate program, we taught them, I taught them in my general education science class. And what I can tell you is that students worked well together. They were supportive of one another. And the general education students learned just as much as their peers in the self-contained classroom and vice versa. And so what that indoctrinated me very early on is that while the students may have an IEP that requires them to get additional time and space in a self-contained classroom, it showed me also that students can learn just as well in the general education classroom. At least that was my experience. So so inclusion, the mere fact of allowing that. So Ms. Ward could have certainly taught science in her classroom, but she chose to work in partnership with me in the teaching of science. And so we had a great experience in doing that. So I think that aspect, that's a huge step, but understanding that again, so what's the back map of that? What professional development might the general education teacher need in that? And so I need to understand that as a superintendent. To say, what are the different instructional models? So when I became a middle school assistant principal, we all went through the different trainings, the one teach, one assist, the co-teaching model, all of those various instructional models. Our whole school district invested time and energy into that professional learning. And then certainly, Priya, as you very well know, some of the best instructional practices have been developed for our language learners. And so then how might those strategies and techniques be applied across the board as well?
And how do you plan on incorporating parent-student input as you consider changes in the district? So in the past, there has been somewhat of a void of input from families. And so they're curious about your thoughts around this.
So one of my tasks that I want to adhere to is the monthly, I think it's the monthly PTO presidents had a meeting with the superintendent. So I definitely want to keep that. But again, I try to be everywhere, not all at the same time. But don't be surprised if I show up to some of the PTO meetings and those types of things. Again, to hear sort of what's top of mind, but how might we leverage our existing structures to get more time on task with those types of things. And again, you're not going to see me coming in saying, initiative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, my job is first to understand what's happening here. Is it working well? Does it need to be refined? Does it need to be thrown out and rebuilt altogether? So it's sort of that level of understanding that I want to understand. But thank you for raising this call for void. But I think then that might be an opportunity to make sure that there is that engagement with the PTOs at the various schools. And if that then is serving as a barrier, then we may need to find another structure that may be more practicable for folks to engage.
So this is an interesting question that was submitted ahead of time about climate change, especially considering your background in science. I think you received a book actually from the Greens team on Inhabitable Earth. And this group was actually wondering, what leadership opportunities on climate change do you suggest? Or how do you feel about, sort of integrating these practices into the curriculum, how we can all contribute more quickly to this really important work?
Yeah, so I definitely get excited about the real world. That's such an overused phrase, but it's the reality of what's practicable right now for our students. So I'm intrigued by what opportunities, and certainly, the resources that are in this community or within this community. I certainly want to leverage those, the community as a classroom model. And again, it's not all in year one, but how might our students gain some experiences there? I saw several messages around composting and those types of things, and recycling, and making sure that those aspects are in our schools. But what opportunities like this might we be able to expose our students with, that goes above and beyond our state standards? So our state standards are certainly the foundation; they're not the ceiling. So what other connections can we make for our students? I'm all over those types of opportunities and would welcome partnerships as such.
So while often misunderstood as a strategy used with students with disabilities, universal design is an instructional approach designed for the general education setting to allow for more inclusivity through lesson plan design and delivery. What is your understanding of UDL, and do you see it to be a useful approach?
Well, again, that's as wide as the sea is deep. But it's again a set of strategies through MTSS that's gained quite a bit of traction. But I always say good teaching is good teaching, and so what worked for my students my very first year of teaching. My approach to teaching that group of students, of that 125 students, had to be modified or tweaked for the second set. And subsequently, I had to modify and adapt for the third set of students, and so forth and so on. So while I may have some tools in my toolbox, my best approach as a classroom teacher was first to understand the students that were in front of me, and how they tackled or how they prospered in their learning, and then adapt my teaching to meet their needs. And so that's where the balance is in that regard. So I'm taking a note on that one because I want to probe further on what else that question is asking.
And what is your experience with working with the CPAC?
So in Lowell, I did not interact with CPAC as closely because we had our director of special education engaged in that work. But I believe CPAC is a group that I've met with, I think here in Brookline, or an initial meeting with, I think, Dr. Marini, if I'm not mistaken. I apologize if I'm misspeaking there. But certainly the Special Education Parent Advisory Council in Rochester, as the Deputy Superintendent of Teaching and Learning, I often attended CPAC meetings. So this isn't so certainly understanding and communicating, one of the things that we wanted to make sure was parents understood their roles and responsibilities from the district perspective at the IEP meetings. One of the things that I undertook at a building as a building principal, high school building principal, is that I would often have meetings with our parents either before or after the IEP meeting to make sure that there weren't any additional questions or needs that were missed or unaccounted for in the course of those meetings. So I want to make sure that I look forward to the partnership, I think, with our special education parent advisory group, understanding what they see as our strengths, but then also what are the opportunities to improve our practice. Because again, all means all in this regard, and we want to make sure that all of our students are thriving in our system.
So a question about after-school programs. So do you feel that after-school programs, most of which are independent nonprofits here in Brookline, are important, not just as childcare, but also for enrichment, socializing, et cetera, especially after the pandemic?
Absolutely, and it's a great opportunity for kids to build further relationships with one another. I was one of those teachers that I grew up under, the full disclosure, and I hope I don't scare anybody, but I grew up under the tutelage of Dr. Rhonda Johnson, who indoctrinated in us, you teach from bell to bell. And so we kept our students engaged and occupied for the full duration of the period. And so whether she was there when the class started or whether she popped in the last 30 seconds of class, the expectation was that students were engaged in learning. And so in that, the manner in which I had my classroom structured, if you were sitting in the front of the room, you may not have had an opportunity to work with the students in the back of the room. But then when I taught, I also taught in our after-school program as well. And so then that gave those students that may not have had the opportunity to work together in the classroom or on the different grade level teams to actually work and interact with one another to further foster and build community within the school. So after-school programming, I think, is a rich opportunity to engage deeper with one another, but then, as you also said, to foster greater learning as well.
Absolutely. And for our lower income families, we are certainly concerned about being able to subsidize financially this year. Are there available dollars in the federal pandemic relief funds to help? Steps to Success is only now starting in grade 3, so younger low income children may have no options unless the program itself subsidizes them. And many are barely hanging on financially as it is. So what are your thoughts about if that's going to be a possibility?
I think that's, I've seen some emails moving around the system addressing this matter. So that's something that our Deputy of Admin and Finance will have him deeply involved in to see what opportunities may exist to make sure that those needs are being met, if at all possible. And so we'll, again, we want to make sure that all of our students are taken care of in that regard.
And actually another comment came in just going back to parent input. The public schools of Brookline have a climate survey that used to be done yearly that actually hasn't been done in the past 2 years. And we were just wondering if you would consider utilizing that or any similar outreach methods or surveys in order to get input.
Do we know which office they came from? I mean, I can find out if that wasn't a part of the question, but yeah, I can do some probing on that one.
Yeah, I know that there was one that we used to give out yearly that came directly from DESE. So I'm not sure if that was the same one, but I know that there are several surveys that you can use over time that can be the same, so you can actually compare results and progress. So I think this will be our last question. With the current suspension of the ECS program, do you have any thoughts on how to move forward with innovation and how to keep maker spaces open?
Again, that's another one that I want to take up with our building leaders next week as well. I know that Dr. Marini set it up to be a pilot study for this school year. So I want to understand ECS a little bit more and certainly look at, again, getting very good with our budget and the accountability and the affordability of all that we have to offer, and be very open with that, so parents and the community can see exactly where every dollar is going in that regard. But certainly there's value in making sure that, again, how might we accelerate learning or engage students more deeply and meet them where they are and grow them to where we expect or know that they can be. And so that's sort of an A to Z blanket that I'll put out there and probe further for all those aspects of our students.
Great. So actually, we did receive another comment from, I'm going to say this wrong, I think Dean Cody. As a member of the Mothers Out Front, which is a grassroots environmental group of mothers, grandmothers, and others who are working hard for a livable future for all children, they are very pleased to hear from you, and they look forward to seeing and hearing your leadership actions to ensure that our students are prepared for a challenging future that will undoubtedly include some very grim climate crisis scenarios. So they just want to let you know that they are here to help and to please call on them.
Priya, tell me the name of that group again.
So the Mothers Out Front.
Out Front? Okay.
And so with that, we are coming to the end of our time. And so I just wanted to take an opportunity also to thank you, Dr. Guillory, and to thank the BPO again for coordinating what I think has been a very productive Q&A session. And with these final minutes, I just wanted to hand it over to you, Dr. Guillory, just one final time for any final words you may want to say, and then back to Ben and Lauren. And again, just from me, a final thank you to all of you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Ben and Lauren, for inviting me. I'm so glad that our schedules were able to align for this very important important community sharing. Again, I am so grateful to have the opportunity to serve the students, families, faculty, and staff of the public schools of Brookline, and I look forward to meeting each and every one of the needs of the various groups, and getting to know and meet you on a one-on-one basis, but then also as a collective group. So thank you again for your time, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Guillory, for sharing so much with us, for your honesty, for your excitement. I think you've generated a lot of excitement. I know I'm excited. I think other parents I've been getting texts from during this webinar are excited. So this is all sounding like it's going to be quite a year. And it didn't, you know, I heard a little bit there that, you know, you're excited to engage with parent groups. So you'll be hearing from Ben and me again. I just wanted to say thank you to soon to be Dr. Priya Tahiliani, who is getting her Doctorate of Education, Urban Education Leadership. So the next time we rope you into this, Priya, it might be Dr. Tahiliani. So anyway, good luck with your endeavors. Good luck with the superintendency in Everett. Good luck with your year. And Dr. Guillory, we'll be seeing more of you, I think, huh? Thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invite.
Thank you, everyone.
I was just going to say my thanks also to both of you. And thanks to everybody for attending. We'll send a video out afterwards. And yeah, I think, you know, we're excited to have you on board, Dr. Guillory, and we know, you know, and also thanks for answering all of this in such so soon, all of these questions so close to the beginning. I'm sure that there's a lot that you're still learning. So
Absolutely.
Looking forward to the coming year.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Everyone, have a great night.